makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Okay, this video is rather dear to my heart because it's related to a topic that I wrote about, which is progress. In fact, if you subscribe to this channel, you should buy my book because that's the only way that I can monetize this channel right now. So, link in the description below. If you subscribe to this Steven Pinkerish view of progress, then you probably imagine that we can just grow forever, right? That science will solve climate change eventually. And, we shouldn't worry about all this leftist fear mongering because leftists don't like progress, according to Pinker. In his own words, progressives hate progress. Now, there's a movement, and if you've sort of read kind of left wing development and environmental work, you may have come across it called degrowth, which, as the title says, basically argues that especially developed countries can't maintain a growth trajectory forever because it will essentially destroy the planet. And really the only solution for climate change to solve the twin problems of how do we solve climate change, but also how do we raise living standards for the majority of the human population, the solution is to degrow the developed world, right? Now, clearly, this has struck a nerve with a lot of people. Growth is seen as like the pinnacle achievement of society these days. Right now, we don't care anymore about planting flags in colonies around the world. We don't really care that much about having uh, more combat divisions than anyone else. Military power, number of dreadnought battleships. That is not really what countries obsess over today. The one obsession that every country in the world has is growing your GDP. That is the symbol of progress in today's world. So, clearly, the argument that you should degrow strikes a nerve because you're basically, it's kind of like if this was the Olympics saying, well, you've already won enough gold medals, you can't win anymore. And in fact, you have to give some away so that other countries can have gold medals. Which might seem horrible, especially if you're a right winger, because right wingers just base their entire mentality of just having more than everyone else. But it's the reason why I would say, unless you are like really leftist, you're probably against degrowth. I have not heard many arguments in favor or even like vaguely sympathetic from the center. Even an economist who I respect quite a lot, Branko Milanovic, he's one of the world's foremost inequality researchers. Um, I think he's a great economist. He has a very great, good Substack, by the way. Um, Even him, who's probably more to the left than 99% of mainstream economists, thinks it's ridiculous. So that's the degree of antagonism that people have towards degrowth. So there was an article posted yesterday or 2 days ago in a website, a British website called UnHerd, which I don't really know how to describe UnHerd. It's this sort of weird kind of like we're not really right wingers. We're just open to it. It has a very kind of intellectual dark web ish vibe to it, and it also publishes people who are in that circle, like Douglas Murray. But they also have other people. Like it's weird. I really can't describe it. I would say it's intellectual dark web light. It's not as abhorrent as the actual IDW, but it's kind of in there, dipping its toes there, uh, in an attempt to kind of present itself as edgy and not being in line with any ideology. That's kind of my impression of UnHerd. Anyway, I'm going to show you. We're going to read. Sorry, that's coming later. Let's read this article or parts of it to see what how badly they argue. So I just want to be straight. Um, my issue with degrowth is not in terms of whether it's A, desirable, or B, feasible. My issue with degrowth is that I think it's patently impossible to occur. Like, I don't think you'll ever get the Western countries to agree to degrowth. So from merely the politics of it, I think it's pointless. And I'm sorry that it sounds very fatalistic. There's a lot of people who I respect uh, who are big fans of degrowth. There's an anthropologist called Jason Hinkle. He's done really good work. He has a one of the best books on development that I've ever read called The Divide, which I strongly recommend. And he's a big advocate of degrowth. I haven't read his degrowth book yet. I really want to with an open mind, but I just think it's politically unfeasible. I don't think this is ever gonna. I mean, we can't even achieve climate targets for Christ's sake. Are you expecting, a country like the U.S. to have its GDP per capita for the sake of the planet? Like, it's just not going to happen. So I'm sorry that I'm sounding really fatalistic here, but that's my view of degrowth. But I will defend degrowth against criticism this bad. So let's see the criticism. And this is from Tom Chivers, who wrote, ironically, for such a piss poor argument, wrote a book called How to Read Numbers, A Guide to Statistics in the News and Knowing When to Trust Them. So just take that in mind when you look at the arguments that he's going to give. And this is why all these sort of um, when you go into a bookstore in the UK and the US, you have all these big ideas section, and it's full of books like this. And when you read what these people actually believe, it really makes you question, like, how on earth do you have the cynicism to write a book on how to read statistics when you don't know the basics of them? So let's read. Two things. First, economic growth saves children's lives. That is one of the most basic, starkest facts about the modern world. Second, there is a thing called the degrowth movement, which wants to stop economic growth. And yes, this would lead almost inevitably to the unnecessary deaths of thousands of children a day. So, what does it sound like? Does this not sound like an abortion debate? Because whenever you resort to the killing children, no one wants to kill children. No one in their right minds wants to kill children. Even Nazis didn't kill their own children. So, are you willing to be worse than Nazis by killing people for the sake of trees? What a horrible human being. So, that first point should immediately spark alarm bells, because you're painting your opponent as essentially subhuman for basically wanting to kill children. That's where he's going. Let's keep reading. Let's deal with the first point first. For most of history, somewhere around a third of children died before their fifth birthday. That awful number has dropped enormously, but even now it's one child in 25. As child mortality has gone down, so has global poverty, while global economic output has increased. Correlation is not causation. Duh. But this isn't just true at a global level, but at a country by country level. Of course, the global numbers are an aggregate of the country by country. This is so stupid. Nowadays, if your country's rich, your children are most likely to live. That is amazingly obvious on this chart. So that's this chart, which I'm gonna explain in a bit. If you live in the rich Iceland, for example, your child is 60 or 70 times less likely to die before its fifth birthday than if you live in the poor Central African Republic or Democratic Republic of Congo, where about one child in every 10 dies in its first 5 years. So now look at the game that he's playing. He's going to compare like one of the richest countries on earth versus one of the poorest and say, gotcha. See how child mortality is so much higher? But I'm going to explain in a bit why this is ridiculous. Okay, actually, no, I'm going to explain it now. So let's look at this chart. Now, if you basically, have an only topical level of statistics and haven't written a book called How to Read Numbers, you will say, you will see this chart and think, oh, wow, the relationship is clearly, it's going there. It's in that direction. Um, there is no doubt whatsoever that there is a relationship between income and child mortality. And to be fair, there is a big one. But that relationship is mostly in the process of moving from developing world status to developed world status. Once you reach a certain level of income, the benefits kind of stop. And to understand this, look at this bit here. Look at the part of the chart that is over 20K in GDP per capita. And most of these countries have child mortality rates of no worse than 1%. So if we're just taking this bit here, or even let's go to 2%, if you just look at this part of the chart, you will notice that the relationship suddenly looks a bit weaker. It certainly doesn't look like a straight line. It's clustered around, like the US has a terrible child mortality rate relative to its income. It's an outlier there. But I decided to download the data and show exactly what that relationship is. So now I'll show you the Excel chart. So that's the same chart. That's the exact same data plotted. Same plot. These are logs, by the way, log scales. So it looks like a linear relationship when it's not linear. And on this basis, if we calculate the R squared in statistics measures how much change in the dependent variable, which in this case is child mortality, how much of that change is driven by the independent variable, which in this case is GDP per capita. So an R squared of 0.56 is pretty good, I would say. So if it was 1, that'd be a perfect relationship. All of the change in one variable, it would be explained by the other. And 0.56 is still, anything above 0.5 I think is respectable. That would mean that over half of the movement is explained by the independent variable. But I made a second chart and I picked only the countries that were above 20K. The R squared is now 0.02. Oh, by the way, I eliminated Qatar, which was a massive outlier because it has a GDP per capita of like 160K. And it was giving an R squared even lower than this. So I was generous and I eliminated Qatar. And the R squared is 0.02. So 2% of the change in child mortality after you achieve 20K of income is explained by income. In other words, hardly any of it. So there's no relationship here at all. Let's keep reading. And on that second point, some people really think that that economic growth should stop right now. Jason Hinkle is a anthropologist and one of the key voices in what is known as the degrowth movement. He argues that in rich countries, at least, this is very fucking crucial. This is not like a side note, because no one's arguing that the developing world needs to degrow. The whole point of degrowth is that we should continue developing. Africa, South Asia, Latin America, etc., so that their incomes rise. And in order to make this rise sustainable, we need to degrow the developed world, right? That's the argument. We ought to stop aiming for economic growth immediately. He thinks that green growth, the idea that we can grow our economies while reducing carbon emissions, is a chimera, or at least that it cannot happen fast enough to avoid disastrous outcomes from climate change. Yeah, that is true. It's unless we suddenly magically invent like fusion power or some amazing green technology that solves the climate crisis in the next 10 years, it's not going to work. That's why, like, I fundamentally do agree with the logic of degrowth. I disagree with the likelihood that it's ever going to happen. But you have to be kidding me. Like, the freaking IPCC report just came out, And every time that an IPCC report comes out, it's far more apocalyptic than the one before it. So, what's your solution, dude? Hinkle, of course, denies that economic growth saves lives. In fact, he doubly denies it. First, he denies that global poverty has gone down as a result of economic growth. In 2019, he argued that all those famous charts showing a huge decline of global poverty are false because they focus on very extreme poverty, people living on an equivalent of 1.90 a day or less. If you look at a more reasonable threshold of poverty, he says, such as $15 a day, the decline disappears. Yeah, he's right. I actually have like 2 chapters in my book based on this. This 1.90 a day is not 1.90 in like today's US dollars. It's based on 2011 US dollars. What this basically means is live on 190 a day in the US in 2011. Good luck surviving on that. So yeah, we have eliminated the very extreme bit of poverty, like the absolute destitute people, which was a much higher number like back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, that has gone down. But poverty as a whole, strip China and India out of the equation, the improvement is not that great. And in fact, during a good part of the 80s and 90s, it was actually getting worse. So during peak globalization and peak neoliberalism, there were proportionally more poor people in the world, both relative and absolutely, if you strip China out of the equation. Yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna skip some bits, but go to the meaty ones. And secondly, Hickel denies that economic growth does save children's lives, or rather that it does beyond a certain quite low level. Past a certain point, the relationship between GDP and social outcomes breaks down or becomes irrelevant. After that, what matters is distribution and access to public services. Yes, that is freaking true. I just showed you. That's what the Excel chart, that's why I did that second Excel chart. Because after that 20K, the improvement in child mortality is negligible. And in fact, you look at the social indicators in almost any country, like human development, after a certain threshold, becomes irrelevant. It does. And I'm going to show you more proof. So, has any of you traveled around Europe, like Central Europe? Have you gone to Hungary, Czech Republic, Croatia, all these countries? They would seem pretty damn affluent. I mean, these are countries that have universal health. If you're American, like you'd be surprised, like the quality of life in those countries. You have universal health care, you have free education, very low crime. These are, cities that are, first world, or countries that are first world, but their incomes are considerably lower than a lot of their Western European peers. And let's take a look at the difference. So here's GDP per capita, and most Western European countries are sort of in the 40K or above range. Look, Austria 48, Australia 50, Sweden 50, Belgium 40, Canada, New Zealand, UK, France. Now let's start going down. Spain is 27, and Spain is pretty damn, they're doing pretty well. Cyprus, Czech Republic is only 22K. How is that possible? Portugal 22, Lithuania less than 20, Latvia 17K, Hungary less than 16K. Have you been to Hungary? Does that look like a country that has a 15K per capita income? Well, now let's look at human development. And let's look at so you've probably seen the Human Development Index, which is published by the UN, but you may not know that there's an inequality adjusted. So HDI does not take into account inequality. So it's a bit idealized. So the inequality adjusted version takes that into account. Now let's look at how these countries rank in terms of human development. Holy shit, Czech Republic 12th globally. That's what you can achieve with 22,000 GDP per capita. 12th place on Earth in human development with 22K a year. Higher than the UK, which has 40K. Way higher than the US, which has 50K. That's the difference. Czech Republic in human development trounces the US. Like, it's not even close. It's not even close. Hungary, with its less than 16K of income, is just barely below the US. 0.808 versus 0.791. That's a negligible difference, to be honest. Holy, Croatia. You know what Croatia's income is? It's like 13K. And it's at the level of Italy, which has over like almost 3 times its GDP per capita. So are you telling me that a country like the US could not lose 20K of income in GDP per capita and not be incredibly affluent? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me that the UK also couldn't? If it went from 40K to 20K, are you telling me that it wouldn't manage to have a society as well off as the Czech Republic? Because they're doing better with what they have. So you can't look at this and tell me with a straight face that you absolutely need 40K to be an affluent society. You don't at all. So that is the most powerful argument in favor of degrowth that you can possibly have. But none of that mattered in this article. No evidence whatsoever provided. Why on earth does the US need 50K of GDP per capita to not even be able to afford its people universal healthcare? You gotta be fucking kidding me. And then he just goes on, like, all he does is compare countries, like the UK or Japan with way poorer countries, poor countries that still haven't gotten to that level of income where they would start to see those huge gains in child mortality, which they have, by the way. Every country, thanks to technology, even the poorest countries on earth now have, it's not income. So that's one thing. Technology has allowed even the poorest country on earth today to have a lower child mortality than even the richest country on earth 100 years ago. That's technology. It's not income. And the reason why income doesn't help you after a point is because most of the improvements that you do institutionally in terms of having like a healthcare system, all that, is in that kind of 15K to 25K range. Like once you get into that level, and especially if there's a country that already had a precedent of like universal health, of good healthcare. So that's why a lot of the Central European countries do so well, because they had, when they were still under communism, they had pretty good healthcare system relative to income. The socialist countries had much better healthcare relative to income than the Western ones. That's a fact. And that's why they do much better in these, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, than a lot of Latin American ones, despite the fact that a lot of Latin American countries have incomes equal or higher than the Central European countries. I'm talking about Chile, Uruguay. They have levels of income that are, like I said, equal or greater, but yet their social outcomes are much poorer. And part of it is also inequality. So, yeah. Nonetheless, it is true that economic growth appears to have saved millions of children's lives. That 14,000 a day would be something more like 10,000, 100,000 a day if children were dying at the rate they used to. Yeah, economic growth, technology, like there's a lot of factors, but he still hasn't proven the notion that reducing the income of the richest countries on earth would kill children, because that's not going to happen. If you have countries that today have levels of child mortality better than the US, that can afford healthcare, even though they have incomes of a third of what the US has, then guess how many children would die if degrowth happened in those countries, in the rich ones? 0. 0 children would die. Yeah. So he goes on basically this whole article is a hit piece against Jason Hickel. Um, he gets a lot of flack. He's also has had some Twitter rows with Steven Pinker, which is why I respect him more than anything else. But dude, like, so yeah, I mean, I just don't know what to say. So in the end, he kind of does argue the degrowth movement is right in one sense. Growth will almost certainly can't carry on forever. If the economy grows 2% a year every year, which it roughly has for the last century or so, then it doubles in size every 35 years. That's not sustainable in the long term. Yeah, duh. So what's your solution? What is your freaking solution? The question, perhaps growth will continue into the far future. I could imagine some weird universe of simulated worlds and uploaded humans, and indeed others have. But probably the most likely outcome is that growth slows or stops or reverses in the next few centuries. The question, of course, is when it should stop. I, for one, would rather wait until the children stop dying so much. Hickel and the degrowth movement think it should be sooner. But if they want to make that case honestly, they should admit the reality of all the dead children. Oh my god, this is seriously like have some friggin' self-respect of not writing an article and smearing your opponent as a child killer. That's insane. That is insane. And I repeat, the issue of degrowth, the focus of degrowth is not for developing countries to stop growing. It's for the rich countries to stop growing and reversing their growth, having more equitable growth. Countries like the US could receive a massive boost to their incomes, their individual incomes, if it was a more egalitarian society. You could spread so much of that wealth and make everyone better off. You could fund services that other countries somehow miraculously have at 15K or 20K of income. And yet, for some reason, the US thinks that it's beyond their capability. This is just nonsense. It's absolute freaking nonsense. And it's completely misunderstanding that degrowth is focused on the rich country. So on that basis alone, this article is trash. Because he completely failed to address the main point. He built a straw man, thinking that people like Hickel just want children to die everywhere around the world. But he clearly didn't even understand what degrowth is. And then his statistics are just piss poor. Because his argument on child mortality, using these figures, which I have shown you, show no relationship whatsoever when you look at us after a certain level of income. There's no relationship there. So, yeah, for a guy who wrote a book called How to Read Numbers, dude, you need to do some basic math again, buddy, because this was some weak ass shit. On that note, thanks for watching this video. Please like, please share, please subscribe. Please buy my book. It's really good. And I haven't read Jason Hickel's Degrowth book, so I can't in all honesty recommend a book that I haven't read. But his book, The Divide on Development, is fabulous. It's really, really good, and I also strongly recommend it. So, yeah, read both of our books. Have a good weekend.